Every state in the country has its own geography, but Florida doesn't just stand out, it practically jumps off the map. A narrow peninsula stretching between two warm oceans. A tropical climate that feels closer to the Caribbean than the American South, lands so flat you could almost mistake it for sea level, and limestone terrain hiding a world of underground rivers and sinkholes. On paper, it sounds like the perfect place for endless cities and non-stop growth. And in many ways, it is. But here's the twist. While Florida is packed with booming metro areas and millions of residents, not all parts of the state share the same story. In fact, northern Florida holds only about 18% of the state's population, roughly 3.9 million people, leaving huge areas surprisingly empty compared to the crowded South. So what's going on here? Why did development explode in some regions while others stayed relatively quiet? And more importantly, why do so few Americans live in Florida's empty north? Florida has a surprisingly deep and complex history within the United States. And interestingly, its story begins long before most other parts of the country ever appeared on European maps. Long before colonists arrived, the region was home to diverse indigenous communities, including the Timucua, Apalachee, Calusa, Tequesta, and many others. Sadly, the arrival of Europeans would bring dramatic and often devastating changes, leading to the disappearance of many of these societies within just a few generations. The turning point came in the early 1500s. In 1513, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon landed along Florida's east coast and gave the land its famous name, La Florida, inspired by Spain's Easter celebration, Pascua, Florida. While legend says he was searching for the mythical fountain of youth because apparently explorers have always loved ambitious side quests, his expedition instead helped claim a vast stretch of mainland territory for Spain. Spain soon established Street Augustine in 1565, which remains the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the continental United States. But building a colony here wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Indigenous resistance, rival European powers like France and Britain, and Florida's unpredictable environment all made survival difficult. And then there was the weather. Spanish settlers quickly learned that Florida's hurricanes don't exactly send polite warning letters. Ships were wrecked, crops destroyed, and settlements damaged repeatedly. In 1559, a massive hurricane devastated a Spanish colonization fleet and a newly founded colony at Pensacola, forcing its abandonment entirely. Despite these setbacks, Spain persisted. Over time, settlers adapted by learning local weather patterns and adjusting their construction methods and agricultural strategies. During the 1600s and 1700s, Florida became a geopolitical chess piece. Britain even established the colony of Georgia as a buffer zone, designed to separate Spanish Florida from the wealthy British colonies of Virginia and the Carolinas. Control of the region shifted back and forth, with Britain briefly gaining possession in 1763 before Spain reclaimed Florida in 1783. The early 1800s brought another major transformation. In 1821, the United States acquired Florida from Spain through the Adams-Ons Treaty, after Spain decided maintaining the colony was no longer worth the cost. American settlers soon arrived, introducing new farming practices and establishing plantations. However, expansion led to conflict with Seminole tribes who had migrated into Florida during the 1700s. These tensions erupted into the Seminole Wars, a series of conflicts lasting from 1817 to 1858. On March 3, 1845, Florida officially became the 27th state of the United States. Statehood opened the door to new opportunities and new challenges, especially with the expansion of agriculture, including cotton and citrus cultivation. Florida has always stood apart from other states, partly because of its origins as one of Spain's oldest colonies, and partly because of its unusual physical geography. But before we dive into Florida's geography, if you're enjoying the journey so far, consider hitting that subscribe button. More fascinating geography stories are only one click away. Out of all the states in the United States, Florida is probably one of the easiest to recognize on a map, thanks to its unmistakable peninsular shape that stretches between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, connected by the Strait of Florida. And this specific location isn't just visually interesting. It plays a huge role in shaping everything from the state's natural resources and climate to the extreme weather events that regularly make headlines. Florida extends roughly 500 miles from north to south and about 460 miles from east to west. Yet despite covering a wide area, the state is surprisingly flat. Its highest point, Britton Hill in the Florida Panhandle, rises to only 345 feet above sea level, which, depending on where you're from, might feel more like a hill you casually walk up rather than a dramatic peak. This low elevation contributes heavily to Florida's environmental characteristics, especially its vulnerability to flooding and storm surges. One of Florida's defining features is its extensive coastline, stretching approximately 1,350 miles, the longest coastline in the contiguous United States, second only to Alaska when considering the entire country. Along the eastern side, the Atlantic coastal plain dominates the landscape, featuring sandy beaches, barrier islands, and rolling dunes that are constantly reshaped by ocean currents, waves, and tides. These coastal zones include lagoons and estuaries that provide essential habitats for marine life and bird species, creating ecosystems that are both ecologically rich and economically important for fisheries. On the western side, the Gulf coastal plain presents a different but equally fascinating environment. Here, a broad and shallow continental shelf extends far into the Gulf of Mexico. Marshes, wetlands, and expansive mangrove forests thrive where fresh water from rivers mixes with salty seawater. These ecosystems act like natural shields, helping to reduce coastal erosion while also serving as nurseries for fish and habitats for diverse wildlife. Moving southward, the Florida Peninsula becomes largely flat, with occasional rolling terrain. This region is home to one of the most iconic ecosystems on Earth, the Florida Everglades. Often described as a slow-moving river of grass, the Everglades flows southward from Lake Okeechobee toward the Gulf of Mexico. This vast subtropical wetland plays a critical role in water filtration, flood control, and biodiversity, supporting species such as the endangered American crocodile and the Florida panther. Florida's climate is primarily humid subtropical across the northern and central regions, gradually transitioning into tropical conditions in the south. The surrounding waters of the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico help moderate temperatures, producing relatively mild winters and hot, humid summers. Of course, that same warm water also fuels frequent thunderstorms and gives rise to one of Florida's most defining challenges, hurricanes. Because of its geographic position, Florida is especially vulnerable to these powerful storms. Warm ocean waters act as a breeding ground for hurricanes, and the state's long coastline, combined with its low elevation, makes it particularly susceptible to storm surges, flooding, and high winds. In some years, Florida can even face storms approaching from both the Gulf and the Atlantic within a single hurricane season, which sounds exhausting just thinking about it. Beneath the surface, Florida hides another geological surprise. Much of the state rests on limestone bedrock, which has gradually dissolved over time, creating sinkholes, freshwater springs, underground rivers, and vast aquifer systems. The Floridan Aquifer, one of the most productive freshwater sources in the world, supplies drinking water to millions of residents and supports the state's agricultural needs. In short, Florida's geography is anything but ordinary, and it's this unique physical landscape that has strongly influenced where people settle, how cities develop, and why certain regions remain more populated than others today. Florida's population distribution is far from balanced. The southern half of the state holds the overwhelming majority of residents, while the northern regions, especially the Panhandle, remain comparatively less populated. As usual, this isn't random. A mix of geographic, economic, and historical factors has shaped where people chose to settle and why certain areas became far more attractive than others. The Florida Panhandle is defined by landscapes filled with swamps, mangroves, and wetlands. While these ecosystems are incredibly important for biodiversity and environmental stability, they don't offer the same postcard-ready appeal as the sandy beaches and resort-friendly coastlines found farther south. Tourism and migration often follow lifestyle appeal. And when people imagine Florida living, they usually picture sunny beaches, palm trees, and waterfront cities, not marshlands and dense wetlands. That difference alone has played a significant role in keeping population density lower in the northern region. Another key factor is infrastructure, or more specifically, the lack of it historically. Unlike southern Florida, which developed around natural harbors and navigable waterways, the Panhandle never gained major maritime advantages. Cities like Miami and Tampa benefited from deep water ports that facilitated trade, shipping, and economic expansion. The Panhandle, by contrast, lacked natural harbors capable of supporting large-scale port development. And with New Orleans already serving as a dominant port near the mouth of the Mississippi River, there was little strategic need for another major hub on the eastern Gulf Coast. As a result, economic growth in the region lagged behind. Southern Florida, meanwhile, had geography working very much in its favor. Natural harbors, such as Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor, along with the Miami River connecting to the Port of Miami, helped create thriving trade networks and booming tourism industries. These advantages fueled the rise of major metropolitan areas, including Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Tampa, Street, Petersburg, and Cape Coral cities that continue to attract new residents from across the United States and around the world. Even Orlando, despite not being a port city, grew thanks to geography. Initially known for its citrus orchards, the city experienced rapid expansion during the Florida land boom of the early 1900s, a real estate frenzy in the 1920s that brought waves of new settlers. Later, its recreation industry and proximity to the Kennedy Space Center added new layers of economic growth, turning it into one of the state's major population centers. Northern Florida does have important urban areas, with Jacksonville serving as the region's primary economic hub. The city boasts a significant port, a diverse economy, and a strong cultural presence. However, despite being the largest city in northern Florida, Jacksonville's metropolitan population still trails behind southern giants like Miami, Tampa, and Orlando. In fact, Jacksonville ranks fourth in metro area population, highlighting the broader trend of population concentration toward the south. Climate differences also play a surprisingly large role. Northern Florida experiences greater seasonal variation, including cooler winters, while southern Florida offers a more consistently warm and tropical environment. For retirees and those chasing year-round sunshine, essentially anyone trying to escape snow shovels forever southern Florida becomes far more appealing. Additionally, southern Florida's climate resembles parts of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, which has attracted significant migration from those regions. This cultural and demographic influence is one reason Miami is often called the unofficial capital of Latin America. Today, Florida's population is led by the Miami metropolitan area, with about 6.1 million people, making it the 8th largest metro region in the United States. Tampa follows with 3.2 million, Orlando with 2.7 million, and Jacksonville with 1.6 million. In the Panhandle, Pensacola is the largest metro area at about 510,000 people, followed by the state capital, Tallahassee, with 309,000 residents. But with such a clear population divide between North and South, one interesting question naturally emerges. Why does Florida even include the Panhandle in the first place? Florida's ownership of the Panhandle, instead of the region becoming part of Alabama, comes down to a series of historical treaties and territorial decisions made in the early 1800s. The borders we see today weren't accidental. They were shaped by colonial claims, negotiations between major powers, and the process of forming new U.S. states. Originally, the land that now forms the Florida Panhandle belonged to Spanish West Florida. Spain controlled the area from the late 1700s into the early 1800s, although its boundaries shifted frequently due to conflicts and agreements with other European nations. During this period, the region existed in a kind of geopolitical tug-of-war, where borders moved almost as often as explorers did. In 1810, settlers living in parts of West Florida grew dissatisfied with Spanish rule and declared independence, hoping to be annexed by the United States. This political shift opened the door for the U.S. to assert control over the territory. The decisive moment came with the Adams Zones Treaty of 1819, an agreement between Spain and the United States that officially transferred all of Florida, including the Panhandle, to American control. Crucially, this treaty clearly defined Florida's boundaries, placing the Panhandle firmly within its borders. When Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821 and later achieved statehood in 1845, these established boundaries remained unchanged. Alabama, which had become a state earlier in 1819, did not significantly contest the arrangement. The territorial lines drawn by the Adams-Onís Treaty and reinforced through the statehood process were widely accepted, effectively cementing Florida's claim to the Panhandle. Interestingly, at the time, the Panhandle wasn't viewed as a highly valuable strategic or economic prize. Because the region lacked the obvious economic importance that might have sparked serious disputes, there was little incentive for neighboring states to challenge ownership. In other words, no one was rushing to argue over territory that didn't yet appear especially valuable, something that looks quite different with modern hindsight. So in many ways, the Panhandle became part of Florida simply because the legal framework established during territorial negotiations said so. While Alabama had opportunities to push for different boundaries, it never strongly pursued the issue. And the lines drawn during Florida's formation as a territory ultimately became permanent. Over time, economic development and migration patterns heavily favored southern Florida, leaving the Panhandle comparatively quieter and less densely populated. The absence of long stretches of iconic sandy beaches, the kind that attract endless waves of sunseekers, certainly didn't help shift that balance. Florida remains one of the most geographically and historically unique states in the country, shaped by a combination of colonial history, natural landscapes, and evolving population trends. And if you've enjoyed exploring its story, consider subscribing for more fascinating geography videos. There's always another map, mystery, or unexpected history waiting just around the corner.